Welcome back to The Lead. Now it's time for the politics lead. The president is overseas, but his poll numbers have him underwater. His approval rating has dropped 8 percentage points over the past month, leaving him at 45%. His lowest rating in more than a year and a half. He can thank scandals from the NSA surveillance leak to the continued questions over Benghazi for that dip. Let's bring in our panel to talk about it. CNN contributor and former senior advisor to Mitt Romney, Kevin Madden, Democratic strategist Tracy Seffel, and chief national correspondent for the New York Times Magazine, Mark Leibovich. Mark, do you think, well, first of all, do you believe this poll? Because I know some people are questioning this poll. It's a very comprehensive poll. Do you think this is just the first one of a whole bunch that are going to show that these scandals have had an effect?
It certainly could. I mean, I think if you look at the period it covers, it's really the first poll that covers the entire run of bad news that sort of clumped into about 10 days about a month ago or 3 weeks ago or so. So, look, I mean, this administration has gotten pretty good at riding the wave of ebbs and flows and poll numbers. I think that especially in the second term, it's easier to sort of not shrug it off, but certainly to ride it out a little bit. And obviously you want these stories to blow over, and hopefully they will for the administration, but you just don't know.
Kevin?
Well, you know, when I look at polls, I always look at the trend line. And what I find troubling if I'm in the White House right now is that the president's trend line on his popularity and the level of trust that Americans have for him is going down, right as many Americans feel that the economy is starting to recover and their perceptions about the economy are starting to go up. Usually, the president rides those numbers up. So that means that there may be an erosion here on attributes, whether or not you can trust this president, whether or not he's a strong enough leader, that may cause some irreparable harm for his second-term agenda. That's what I'd be very worried about.
Now, and we should also say just that Congress is having incredibly poor approval ratings as well, and that's always when you say to the White House your approval ratings are bad, they said, well, Congress is barely out of the single digits, and that's true. But Tracy, if you worked at the White House right now, would you be worried?
Well, it's interesting. I also, like Kevin, like to look at trend lines, but I don't see any reason for concern here. And one of those reasons is because if you look a little deeper beyond the overall approval and you look at voters' opinions on the economy and jobs, he's actually unchanged. He's within the margin of error. There is not that devastating dip that others are trying to portray. So that's the #1 concern
on the
of
economy
voters.
and jobs.
On the economy and
Where
jobs.
is he on that? What's the exact
He's
number?
within the margin of error. So there's not a strong dip in the way that we're talking about overall approval numbers. And that's the encouragement here, that this isn't some devastating dive that's unrecoverable. I think Mark's point about the clump of scandal coverage is certainly something that would have an impact. And to your point, that voters look around and say, well, nothing's getting done in Washington, and does Obama bear some blame for that?
One of the things that's so interesting is that he has a huge drop among young voters. Down 17 points over the past month among people under 30. One thing that he's now recently done that people disagree with also even more is on Syria. 70% of Americans oppose sending arms to the Syrian rebels, according to the new Pew poll conducted before and after White House announcement on Thursday on chemical weapons. Just shifting to this is exactly what President Clinton in that quote-unquote private meeting said Obama should not worry about. Don't worry about the polls, just do what you think is right. Do you think that's the right advice?
Well, I mean, I think, look, as the one member of this panel who doesn't look at trend lines, I guess, I feel I need to speak for the non-trend line viewers.
We appreciate that. We welcome all views.
No, look, I mean, President Clinton obviously has a great deal of credibility as a fellow re-elected president who actually knows how to take a moral imperative or think he's taking a moral imperative into making a decision like this that is, frankly, much more remembered by history than it is by short-term poll numbers. So I think that's clearly something that could resonate with the president, and I think obviously he speaks with a bully pulpit there.
Well, I think with younger voters, it's that he always patterned himself as somebody who was challenging the status quo. He was a very different politician. He's become very conventional in their eyes. I think with Syria, the big problem is that he hasn't really made clear to the American public what the objectives are and what the goals are of his policy. And so I think there's a muddled message coming out of the polls because there's a muddled message coming from the president.
Well, and possibly, Tracy, last word on this, because he is obviously very ambivalent about this. President Obama himself seems very torn.
Well, he has been for good reason. These are impossible choices. Do you attempt to intervene in a civil war, recreate, with the Russia on one side and the U.S. on another? It's a very 1980s dynamic. Or do you attempt to create peace in the Middle East? And who's had success there?